By the time Senator Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, made the last of his repeated pleas to President Trump to keep his distance from the Senate candidacy of Roy S. Moore, it was too late. To Mr. McConnell, only the president could extinguish a fire that he sees as endangering Republican Senate majority. But Mr. Trump, speaking by phone last Tuesday with Mr. McConnell, responded with the same argument he had been making for days inside the White House. The women who have called Mr. Moore a sexual predator, the president believes, may not be telling the truth. 40 years is a long time. He's run 8 races, and this has never come up, Mr. Trump said to the television cameras on the South Lawn hours after his conversation with Mr. McConnell, effectively endorsing Mr. Moore before boarding Marine One. He says it didn't happen, the president added. You have to listen to him, also. Mr. Trump's decision to reject every long-shot plan to save the Senate seat reflects the imperative that an unpopular president faces to retain his political base, a determination that he should follow his own instincts after having felt steered into a disastrous earlier endorsement in the Alabama race, and even his insistence that he himself has been the victim of false accusations of sexual misconduct. Continue reading the main story. The Trump White House. The historic moments, head-spinning developments and inside the White House intrigue. Jared Kushner's vast duties, and visibility in White House, shrink. November 25. Why Made in America is stitched into the law, but not the uniforms. November 24. A Mar-a-Lago Thanksgiving, it's all gravy. November 23. Justice Department orders review of background check system for gun buyers. November 22. Blast from the past, the current political world mirrors 2009. November 22. See more. Related coverage. Trump defends Roy Moore, citing candidate's denial of sexual misconduct. November 21, 2017. For Roy Moore, a long history of combat and controversy. November 18, 2017. Republicans try to block Moore's path as candidate denies sexual misconduct. November 10, 2017. But in tying himself to Mr. Moore even as congressional leaders have abandoned the candidate en masse, the president has reignited hostilities with his own party just as Senate Republicans are rushing to pass a politically crucial tax overhaul. Mr. McConnell and his allies have been particularly infuriated as Mr. Trump has reacted with indifference to a series of ideas they have floated to try to block Mr. Moore. The accusations against Mr. Moore have lifted Democrats' hopes of notching a rare victory in the Deep South in next month's special election, which would narrow the Republican Senate majority to a single seat. Just as significantly, the president has handed the Democrats a political weapon with which to batter Republicans going into the midterm elections, that they tolerate child predation. I was surprised, and I think it's a high-risk move, said Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who has established a rapport with Mr. Trump. As Mr. Moore has rejected calls to drop out even as more women have accused him of preying on them when they were teenagers, Republicans have given up any hope that he will fold his campaign. Mr. Trump has repeatedly told his aides that he does not believe Mr. Moore would ever quit. What the president did not foresee was that the friction would reach inside his immediate family. He vented his annoyance when his daughter Ryanka castigated Mr. Moore by saying there was a special place in hell for people who prey on children, according to 3 staff members who heard his comments. Do you believe this? Mr. Trump asked several aides in the Oval Office. Mr. Moore's Democratic opponent in the Alabama race, Doug Jones, quickly turned her comments into a campaign ad. But something deeper has been consuming Mr. Trump. He sees the calls for Mr. Moore to step aside as a version of the response to the now famous Access Hollywood tape, in which he boasted about grabbing women's genitalia, and the flood of groping accusations against him that followed soon after. He suggested to a senator earlier this year that it was not authentic, and repeated that claim to an advisor more recently. In the hours after it was revealed in October 2016, Mr. Trump acknowledged that the voice was his, and he apologized. So Mr. Trump has been particularly open to the idea, pushed by Mr. Moore's defenders, that the candidate is being wrongly accused, even as Mr. McConnell and a parade of other Republicans have said they believe the accusers. When a group of senators gathered with the president in the White House last week to discuss the tax overhaul, it took little to get Mr. Trump onto the topic of Mr. Moore, and he immediately offered up the same "it was 40 years ago" defense, according to officials at the meeting. Mr. Trump's responses to the Moore revelations have been pronounced but not consistent. He accepted the candidate's initial denials, and then was shocked at how tepid Mr. Moore appeared when asked during an interview with Sean Hannity whether he still maintained his innocence, according to one person close to the president. Privately, Mr. Trump has acknowledged that he is making a cold political calculus in the hope that the Republicans will hold on to the seat. A White House official on Saturday reiterated the president's view that he believes Mr. Moore should quit the race if the allegations are proved true, but the official stressed that the candidate has denied them. Absent action from Mr. Trump, party leaders have explored, and abandoned, a number of ways to derail Mr. Moore. They considered recruiting another Republican to run a write-in campaign against Mr. Moore and Mr. Jones, but 2 private polls showed that such a candidacy would have no chance of success. Both polls, commissioned by Republican groups in mid-November, found Mr. Jones leading Mr. Moore in a head-to-head election and winning handily in a 3-way race, according to people who reviewed the results. Public polls have indicated a very close race. Mr. McConnell and his allies have believed for weeks that disaster awaits. Win or lose, if Mr. Moore remains in the race, either the Democrats will claim the seat on December 12, or Mr. Moore will win and thrust the party into an agonizing months-long debate over whether to expel him.